says, I ain't gonna touch you, Frederick. He runs off. We're still in the midst of the battle. Another slave comes. But this one had the sense just to open up the door and look in and to say to himself, I don't want none of that. He shut the door and go about his business. Now there was another young lady, but she was a big burly young lady who was a slave. Master called for her. Get in there and get Frederick off me. Get Frederick off me. She kindly says, Master, I'm not here to help you fight Frederick. So don't call me. I'm going about my business. Now I'll let you know I was glad that she didn't come. Because if she would have came, she would have beat me. Because she was a big old woman. That's right. So I was happy. But when it was all said and done, Master was on the ground. And I was standing tall. I had beat my master. Now, I could have got killed for doing that. I'll say it again. I could have got killed for beating my master. Now, did my master go out and tell the other slave owners, the other slave masters, that he got whipped? He dare not. Because he's supposed to be the what? The slave breaker. But the slaves broke him. And then he has nerve enough, the next day, he said, Frederick, don't have me get at you. So you better do what I tell you to do. In my mind, I'm saying, you don't want none of this. You best to keep moving on. So the last 6 months of my time on this plantation, Frederick never mustered up the nerves to whip me again. I felt sorry for those other slaves who got whipped. One thing about them slave masters, they'll whip the poor slaves. They'll whip the weak slaves. They'll whip the passive slaves. But if you're a slave that is attempting to stand up for yourself, either they will kill you by shooting you, or they'll leave you alone. I'm just glad they decided to leave me alone. Well, after I left for Master Corvey's plantation, I was shipped to another plantation, Master Freeman. Now, Master Freeman, notice his name, Free Man. Yes, we had to do the work. But once the sun went down, we were free to do what we wish. And while some of the other slaves would go out and drink, some of them would go hide off and have intercourse, whatever the case is. But I would gather a book, and I would begin to read. Because I wanted to educate my mind. And see, the slave masters, in their talking, they made a mistake. They mentioned a word, I believe that word was evolution. So it's short for evolutionists. And I was always curious as to what that word was, what that word means. I didn't know. I even looked it up in Westford Dictionary, and I still could not figure out what it means. Until I heard somebody say we got to contain those slaves before they become evolutionists. That means they fought for their freedom. And I made up in my mind that I was going to help out as many as I can to forge their way to freedom. But how was I going to do that? Well, the way that I did it, was to get maybe 20 to 30 to 40 slaves out in the woods and begin to teach them how to read. Ladies and gentlemen, some of these slaves were just as young as these babies here and just as old as 60, 70, 80 years old. Well, in the midst of my teaching these slaves, I have you know, there was Judas. Judas, if anybody know about Judas, Judas was the one that would run back and tell those masters, Master Frederick out there teaching them boys how to read, them slaves how to read. You need to go out there and you need to whip them. And you know that's what the masters would do. They came out with stones, sticks, and they beat us. They broke up our little congregation. And you know who went to jail? I went to jail. Well, this was one time, ladies and gentlemen, that I was happy to go to jail. Take me to jail, because when you take me to jail, I will get the opportunity to eat 3 good meals. I will have the opportunity to take me a shower. I will have the opportunity to sleep in a nice bed, which I did. Now, the only problem is, outside those walls were slave masters that wanted to get their hands on me. They would be shouting, Frederick, we want back to my master, Hugh Ard. Because Master Hugh Ard came and got me. And when he came and got me, he mentioned to me, he said, boy, I got a good mind to send you to Mississippi. Now, if they would have sent me down to Mississippi, you all would have never heard of a Frederick Douglass. Because there's no escaping out of Mississippi. Now, I got to bring it up to the current time. My heart goes out to all those people that live in Mississippi right now. But anyway, that's a different story. Moving back. Excuse me, man, please don't make me laugh. I'm trying to tell a story up here, okay? But moving back to what was going on. Master Hugh Ard came and got me, and he began to teach me a trade. He taught me how to be a ship caulker. Now, the caulker basically is putting hay in between the cracks of the wood so the ship can stay afloat. And not only that, it also taught me how to read. Because on these plaques, they would have L for left, right, R for right, or up for up. And I would start reading and watching them as they put these planks into place. Now, the only thing that I didn't like working in this shipyard is the fact that being the only black that I was, they could misuse me. I almost had to be 15 different Fredericks at one time. Because they were like, Frederick, get that wood. Frederick, bring me that hammer. You slave, you get over here. Come here, boy. You heard me, boy. Come over here, you in. I'll butt you in your head. Now, please understand, when Master Corvée and I had our fight, I swore that no one else would beat me down. If you beat me down, we're going to fight down. And as a matter of fact, we had a big fight, and that fight left me for the rest of my life with my left hand. My wrist was broke. And the only thing I can say out of that is I look back, I'm glad it was my left and not my right. Because my right allowed me to write. It allowed me to write those illegal passes. Those illegal passes that would one day get me to freedom. I had to get those whippings before that freedom came. But that freedom came on September the 3rd, 1838. And as a matter of fact, let me back up. Master allowed me to go out and work. My first job, I would bring home $6 a week. That whole $6, I had to give it to Master. Master felt guilty that he was taking my money and not work for it. So Master decided in his heart, bless him, to pay me some money out of my money that I gave him. So he paid me a whole nickel. Yes, a whole nickel. Sir, I saved those nickels. But eventually I wound up getting another job that paid me $10 a week. Master didn't know that I was getting paid $10 a week. So what I would do, I would go home and take those $6 and give them to Master. Master even gave me a raise. Master raised me from a nickel to a quarter a week. That's right, but he didn't know I had those other $4. And those other $4 I would take out to the woods where I dug a hole and I would start saving those $4. And those $4 eventually stacked up. And then while they're stacking up, I had the great pleasure, sir. Sir, I had the great pleasure of courtshiping. I courtship with my future wife. As a matter of fact, allow me to walk over, because I'm proud of my wife, to show my future wife, no other than Anna Murray. Now, Anna Murray was a free woman. And at the time, I say I might have been about 19, and she was maybe about 18. Now, Anna knew some things that I didn't know. That's why we worked well. Because Anna, she worked. And as she worked, we began to talk about my freedom. And she said, Frederick, I can sell some of my things to help you get up north. And I said, Anna, would you? And she said, yes, Frederick, for you. And so we grabbed each other and we hugged each other. And next thing I know, she was selling some of her merchandise. And she came up with the money that was needed to help me make this track. And not only that, she knew somebody else who had a sailor suit, red shirt, white pants, and some shoes. And not only that, sir, she knew somebody that had an ID, a fake ID. Well, I put that uniform on, and I made my way on the train. Now, did I walk directly onto the train? Ma'am, no I didn't. Thank you. I didn't walk directly on that train. How did I get on that train? That's right. That's right. She said it. That's right. I ran on the train from the back. Thank you, my sister. That's right. And I managed to get on that train, and when I got on that train, I sat down. And as I sat down, I noticed on the car, there were some other black passengers. There were two young black men there. There was a black woman here, a little further back. So as I sat down, I gathered myself by the window, and I could hear the conductor coming up. Tickets, ticket, ticket, tickets, tickets. Well, when he got to the two gentlemen, I could just hear him. You boys got the ticket? You boys better have a ticket. If you don't have a ticket, I'll throw you off this train right now. And when he got to me, standing here, he says, young man, I see that you're in the military. Where you headed at? I said, sir, I'll be gathering myself back to the fort. He says, do you have a pass? I said, I usually don't travel with my pass because I leave it at the fort. He said, do you have any ID on you? I said, yes, sir. So I go in my coat pocket and I pull out my ID. Fake, but I pull it out. And the only thing on it is the American flag. And I flashed it real quick. And he saw it. And I put it back. And he says, all right. Now you be quiet and I better not hear a sound out of you. Well, I have you know the rest of my way to New York, I was the quietest one on it. You would have heard a mouse and not me. Sweat just flowing down my brow. I was nervous and what have you. It took us 24 hours to get to the docks of New York City from Baltimore. And when I got to Baltimore, and when I stepped off that train and I started walking through, and I saw black men with suits on and tall hats. I saw black women walking with wonderful dresses on, them big gigantic dresses on with their little pocketbooks and their little teeny hat on. And I saw a man, he just took his hat off and he bowed to the woman, madam. And I said, wow, that's cool, I like that. But then after I saw that, the next moment, as I was looking around, I saw a sign. And the sign said, wanted, runaway slave, $50. Wanted, runaway slaves, $100. Wanted, runaway slaves. So right then I knew I couldn't trust anyone. Because there were blacks that would turn you in as well for a payday. And as a matter of fact, there were a couple of blacks on my track that would step to me, if you will, and they would ask me, are you a runaway slave? And then quickly I would say, no, I'm from New York. Just so they wouldn't know my true identity. Well, another gentleman stepped to me and he says, come, come. It looked like you done ran, come. And I was kind of nervous, but I went with him. He took me to this lawyer's house. When he took me to the lawyer's house, we went up into the lawyer's house and the lawyer made me feel at home. As a matter of fact, he set out a whole brand new pair of clothing for me. He fed me, allowed me to sleep, and not only that, the next morning when I came downstairs, there was a special guest sitting downstairs in the living room, or should I say, the parlor. And that special guest was no other than my Anna. He had sent all the way to Baltimore for my Anna. That's right. And he said, Frederick, Washington, Augustus, Bailey, it's time that you change your name. So I started thinking. And believe it or not, everybody in that home, their last name was Johnson. He said, Frederick, how about Johnson? I thought about it and I said, well, there's a lot of Johnsons in this house. And if I'm out there roaming and somebody catch me, that would be a perfect target to be a slave again as Johnson. So I turned it down. And then there was this play, The Lady of the Lake. Inside this play, there was an actor who had the name of Douglas. Douglas with 2 S. So I took on the name Douglas. But I told him I need the other S. So when people pronounce my name, they will not pronounce it as Douglas, but they will pronounce it as Douglas. It had to have a ring. So the good chap who allowed us to stay with him, he said, okay, well, you got your name, Douglas. So you and Mrs. Douglas board the plane and move out before you become Bailey again. Well, we loaded up And we moved on and got on the train and we went up to New Bedford. And when we got to New Bedford, Connecticut, and we got off those trains, I was so amazed at what I saw. I saw black folks living in beautiful homes, not huts. I saw black folks with carriages and nice horses, and I was like amazed. Well, after we were shown to a nice little home, we moved in, Anna and I began to get jobs. I must have had about 6 or 7 jobs. And there was a gentleman that came to me and he started talking to me about the Liberator. He said, "You ever heard about the Liberator? The Liberator is an anti-slavery magazine, newspaper that talks about what's going on down south." So I said, "No, I never heard of it." He said, "Well, you should go and get you a copy. Do you know anything about slavery?" And I said, "Sir, do I know anything about slavery? I wear slavery on my back." And he said, "Oh, you was a slave?" I said, "Yes, I was a slave." "Oh, I'm sorry, sir. I didn't know that." He said, "Well, here, you can have a Liberator." You know what I did? I turned around to him and I said, "I don't want your charity. I'll pay for it." And I said, "How much is it?" He said, 10 cents. So I gave him the 10 cents for the newspaper and I started reading, and I liked what I heard and what I read because of the fact that it was about denouncing slavery. And he invited me to a meeting. So I went to the meeting. And I'm sitting and I'm listening to the speakers. And then there was this white man that stood up and he started talking. And the white man said, "We must end slavery. And we must do it now." And they said, "You know, they called for me to come up and speak." At this time, I'm about 21 years old, and they're asking me to come up and speak. I'm nervous. And they said, "Frederick, please come up and speak." And when I got up to speak, I started stuttering and I was scared. But by the time I got finished, an hour later, all the white folks in the house, they got up and they started clapping. And then Mr. William Lloyd Garrison, he came up and he said, "Now, you just heard a man speak. Now you telling me this is a slave?" And everybody out in the audience shouted, "No! This man, is he a free man? Yes! Did y'all like what y'all just hear? Yes!" And next thing you know, when it was all said and done, Mr. Garrison stepped to me and he said, "Frederick, I would like for you to go on a 6-month speaking tour talking about ending slavery." And I mentioned to him, I said, "Sir, but I do not have proper education. I don't have institutional education." And he responded by saying, "You could have fooled me. Because of the way you're speaking, you sure?" I said, "Sir, I carry my PhD on my back." So he said, "Turn around so I can see it." "No, I'm talking about the whips." He said, "Oh, okay." And next thing you know, 1845, my first book came out. The Narrative and Life of Frederick Douglass. And nobody believed that I wrote that book. Now the foreword was done by no other than Mr. Garrison, who I love and I cherish this man. So he did the foreword to the book. Would you believe 11,000 copies were sold? Not just in America, but would you believe this book was translated into 5 different languages? The Narrative and Life of Frederick Douglass. Well, because I had named all my masters and I named some of those little white boys who were poor, I named everybody in that book. Mr. Garrison came to me and said, "Frederick, you was about ready to leave. You got to get out of here because you done named everybody. Those masters going to come up here and be looking for you." Well, they put me on a boat. And it took us 3 weeks to get to Canada. I was about 27 years old. And when I got to Canada, I was speaking everywhere. They were hiring me to speak everywhere. The word must have got over about my speaking abilities. 2 years later, at the age of 29, I was at a ritzy affair with the town notables. And Miss Staton, Elizabeth Staton, approached me. And she said, "Frederick, we have some exciting news for you." I said, "Oh?" Now, I was in my dignified mode, if you will. "Oh?" She says, "Frederick, we sent $750 to your master, you are now a free man. And I just looked. I was startled. And I slowly turned around and looked at her and, did you say I was a free man? And she was very giddy. Yes, Frederick, yes, you are officially free, Frederick. We paid your master. You can stay here if you wish. You can bring your family over if you wish. Yes, you don't have to go back to that place anymore because you're free. It must have took maybe about another 5-10 minutes before that long before I answered her. And I said, I owe you so much for what you've done and how you incorporated my freedom. Thank you. How can I thank you? But I must let you know I must travel back to the United States. I must travel back to the United States because that's where I was born. I must travel back to the United States because there are more black people over there that are still in bondage. And they need somebody to fight for them. So my freedom does not have any bearings if I stay here. Please understand my plight. And she says, okay, Frederick, but please understand, you don't have to go. Well, another occurrence happened, and I didn't mention, me and Anna, we had 5 children. My baby girl, Annie, had just passed away. She was 10 years old. So that was another reason that I had to head back to the States. So when I came back to the States, I came back in through Delaware so that way I would not be detected. So I managed to make it to the house where we funeralized my daughter. But I also came back a free man. And upon being a free man, and by this time we had moved to Rochester, New York, I started my own printing press, where I had my newspaper, the Frederick Douglass Weekly. We changed it from the Frederick Douglass Weekly to the North Star. We also, or should I say, Mr. Garrison and I, we began to have 2 different sites of one issue, the United States Constitution. He wanted to denounce the United States Constitution. I wanted to keep the United States Constitution. And I wanted to use the Constitution against America. And I won. Even though Mr. Garrison began to denounce me. He started putting out bad, false information about me. And not only that, on our home on 1st Street in Rochester, New York, I have you know, with my family in the home, the KKK came and bombed my home. No one was injured, but I lost all of my documentations, all of my newspaper information, my printing press and everything went up. As the time winds down, I must tell you about the most important time of my life. It came in the year of 1860 when I heard about the election. There were 3 gentlemen that was running for President of the United States of America. The first gentleman, quite naturally, he had a ring to my name. And because his name was Douglas, I thought for sure that I was going to help Mr. Douglas become president. But once I started reading his platform, I found out that Mr. Douglas was for slavery. So he was X'd. The next gentleman, Mr. Richardson, he had no luck. But then there was a young man, tall young man, about 6'4", thin, and I believe he came from Illinois. His name was no other than Abraham Lincoln. Now please keep in mind, Mr. Lincoln, his wife Addie, they had some slaves. Now keep in mind that Mr. Lincoln, though he had slaves, he just had it in his mind that one day slavery was going to end. And because of situations like that, his thought pattern, I began to help him to win the candidacy for President of the United States. So in 1860, he became our 16th president. And not only that, I had a charge. And my charge was to get to that White House and have a sit down with Mr. President. And when I finally was invited, or should I say the first time, pardon me, I just feared I was not invited. I made my way, and I made me invited. How about that? As a matter of fact, I found my way to the Oval Office where Mr. Lincoln was sitting. And when Mr. Lincoln just stood up, I just went up with him. How you doing, Mr. President? And he looked down upon me and he said, Frederick Douglass, it is so good to see you. Please have a seat. And when he allowed me to sit, or invited me to sit, I sat in the most dignified posture that I could muster up, such as. And he asked me, Mr. Douglass, what can I do for you today upon this visit? And I said, Mr. President, first and foremost, thank you very much for allowing me this opportunity to come in and have this time with you. But there are three things that are on my mind currently. The first thing that is on my mind, and the most notable thing, is the freedom of my people. The second thing is, as the Civil War was about to begin, I wanted to make sure that black men were able to serve in the war. But not just serve in the war, but I wanted them to be treated as equals. Meaning that if white soldiers slept in the barracks, I wanted black soldiers to sleep in the barracks as well. Meaning that if white soldiers got the opportunity to have a proper meal, I wanted that for for black soldiers as well. I wanted equal pay for both races who were serving and giving their life in this Civil War. And my third plea was the freedom to vote. Not just for the men to vote, but women, so that their votes could count as well. So, ladies and gentlemen, I just gave you what is known as the 13th Amendment, which falls under the freedom of blacks in this country. I gave you the 14th Amendment, which is so that black men could serve in the Civil War or in the military. And, of course, the 14th Amendment, the voting rights. Well, Mr. Lincoln got up from his chair, and he went to the window, and he opened up the shade, he looked out, and he paused, and he turned around, and he said, Mr. Douglass, I understand your plight, sir, but if we move too quickly, we will cause a major issue for our country. I ask that you just give us some time and work with us. Now, ladies and gentlemen, in case you don't know, when President Lincoln asked for time and he looked out the window, the time that he was talking about was a whole nother 100 years, which would have put us at 1963 and your Dr. Martin Luther King in Washington, D.C. So that means that from the year 2020 all the way back to 1963, blacks in this country would have been just walking across the Freedom Trail. Well, on the night that pastors, businessmen, and just regular folks in Rochester were out and about, the word came. A gentleman jumped off his horse, and he gathered our attention, and he unraveled the documentation in his hand, and he said, "Heal thee, heal thee, heal thee." We all tended to listen. This was January the 1st, 1863, and he mustered up these words. He said, "This document was signed as of January the 1st, 1863, stating that all blacks in these continental American United States is officially free starting on this day, January 1st, 1863, which is known as the Emancipation Proclamation. And when he finished reading, you can only imagine the celebration. We celebrated for maybe 2 or 3 days. But how did we celebrate? Did we celebrate getting drinking? No, we celebrated in the chapel, thanking God for our freedom. And shortly after that, Anna and I, we moved to Washington, D.C., to our new home in Anacostia. These are just pictures of the home, which is better known as Cedar Hill. I became known as the Lion of Anacostia. And in the midst of moving to Cedar Hill, after 40 years of a wonderful marriage to my sweetheart, Anna, she passed away. And upon her passing, it took a lot of steam out of me. I was on the verge of quitting and just giving up. But I had a friend, and some of you all might know who this friend is. As a matter of fact, she was supposed to appear on a $20 bill. I had a friend, Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman would come by the house in Rosetta, my oldest daughter, which is the young lady, see my 4 kids there? That's Rosetta, Charles, Frederick Jr., and Lewis. She would gather tea for Miss Harriet and I. And Miss Harriet would tell me, she'd say, Frederick, you have come a long way. Don't give up. You still have more work to do. And just keep in mind, as she turned away to look at the big portrait of Anna on the wall, and she says, Anna has paved along a lot of things, opened up a lot of doors for you. She still loves you, and just be strong. And I took that to heart. And I want to thank my children, especially Rosetta, for helping me to come through. And then shortly after that, I got my first post, which was president of the Freeman National Bank. I became the first black president of the Freeman National Bank. Not only that, in 1852, I got 1 vote. I got 1 vote.
Good evening. The library will close in 15 minutes. If you need help completing your task, we'll be happy to assist you. Please return all laptops to the kiosk at this time. The library closes at 8 p.m.
Thank you for your patience, ladies and gentlemen. I got 1 vote as vice president.